All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons. I'm ready. Are you ready? I hope you're ready. I've got a great episode for you today with Daniel Bessner. He's back on the show to talk about foreign policy and a bunch of other stuff. Excited about that. Just wanted to mention, before we get started, foreign policy stuff is I think that the left is really bad at that stuff, which is interesting because, I studied the Vietnam War, and the war was an entryway to the left for so many people in that era, for especially young people, obviously. But war was an entryway for me too, and for a lot of people, I think, that came up during the Bush years, and I say George W. Bush years. I've talked about that in the program, 9/11 and all that stuff, particularly the way that the war on terror was perpetrated, the war in Iraq, which The spring of 2003 is honestly one of the most memorable times of my life, in part because I was getting ready to move to New York City, and a bigger way because the war in Iraq was being planned and perpetrated right in front of our eyes. And I've said this many times, but it felt like literally being in the room while someone is planning a murder and then watching them do it right in front of you. And that has ended up being more than 1 million murders, actually, because the war in Iraq has continued to plunge that region of the world into chaos. And the American relationship to that has been a really important lens for me and others I know to understand this country and to understand capitalism and even the big stuff we talk about when we talk about Marxism. So, war and imperialism is something that we need to get a handle on. And I think that during the 2016 election, obviously you don't expect much, you don't expect anything from Democrats from foreign policy, but you would expect that people that are a little further left to have something to say beyond just kind of kowtowing to the American military machine, support our troops and shit like that. But I have to say that, when Bernie was running in 2016 in the primaries, his stuff on foreign policy was fucking awful. It was probably, honestly, his comments on Israel and his continued comments on Israel were probably the number one reason why I'm not a big Bernie supporter, a big Bernie fan. He's changing his mind, and I think he's starting to see that that's an integral part of his project. He gave a speech last week where he kind of laid out a plan for a kind of new world order type of thing. And he's starting to address some of that stuff. But coming out against Israel seems to be something that should be, to me, absolutely 100% a litmus test for being on the left. If you support Israel at all in any respect, you're not part of the left, as far as I'm concerned. You can call me a purist, whatever the fuck. I don't care how you support that shit and how you give any strength and comfort to Zionists is just unreal to me. You can't do that. You can't do that, man. So anyway, the left needs better foreign policy. The left needs to get it together in thinking about imperialism. And my guest today, Daniel Bessner, I had him on the show many episodes ago. Go back, I think it's episode 85 or something like that. Go back and look at Daniel Bessner. He tells his whole story on the show, the Nostalgia Trap style. But I wanted to have him back because he wrote this editorial in the New York Times a couple weeks ago that you should check out. It's got an awful title. It's something about lecturing Ocasio-Cortez about the China Sea or something like that. But just look up Daniel Bessner New York Times editorial when you Google that. And I'll put it in the description for the episode, a link to the editorial. But anyway, Daniel lays out a plan for the left. Basically, what are the kind of major themes and broad ideas that the left should maybe start talking about when they talk about foreign policy. So, he's talking about democracy and accountability and things like that. Big ideas, but I think it's stuff that gives us a kind of place to start. But I also pushed back a little bit with Daniel. I think we had a really great talk because, part of me is what are we even talking about here in terms of think tanks and getting more of these fucking Ivy League motherfuckers to be part of the military machine. I know Daniel has a more nuanced view of it than that, but we get into it on this episode. I think that there are agreements and disagreements with the stuff that Daniel's doing. They're all ideas worth thinking about. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Daniel Bessner. If you like the stuff we do on Nostalgia Trap, please support the show. We are totally alone. We're not the cool kids. We've tried being associated with a couple magazines, Baffler and Jacobin, and for a number of reasons that hasn't worked out. So we're, again, just on our own. And, this show I'm at this point an adjunct that is teaching. Well, let's see. Let me count it up. I'm about to head to a campus right now. I am teaching 5 courses at 3 different campuses, and all of those campuses are separated by about 100 miles. So I do a big loop all throughout the day, all throughout the week. And all I do is think about this show and wanting to come back and do more interviews and do more stuff. And so if you can support the show, all of that support goes to help us create more of these episodes and make this thing happen and keep it up on the air. Because to me, this is my voice in the apocalypse. And it's the voice of people that I think are important that we ought to be hearing about as the world turns into a nightmarish piece of shit, which it has been for a while, but it seems like things are accelerating now. So if that stuff matters to you, and these episodes matter to you, please support the show. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Give me like $5 a month, subscribe to the show. That's like a cup of coffee to you. It's a lot to us because it adds up with the subscribers, and we actually have a little bit of money to work with. I've mentioned our equipment is failing, etc., etc. We need your help. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and we're gonna get bonus episodes up for you, etc. And there's already a bunch of bonus episodes up there that you can access once you subscribe. All right, cool. Thanks so much for supporting the show, and enjoy this episode. This is the left's foreign policy, or at least the foreign policy the left ought to have, talking with American foreign policy expert and University of Washington professor Daniel Bessner. All right, Daniel Bessner, thank you so much for joining me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
I had a really good time talking. I realized that I looked back at the episode we recorded. It seemed like we recorded it pretty recently, but it was a while ago. It was like episode 82 or something like that. If people want to go back in the archives and listen to Daniel's first appearance, where you talked a lot more about your book and the kind of this, the rise of the kind of defense intellectual thing. But today I wanted to touch base with you about kind of what's going on in the world. It's hard not to talk about the Kavanaugh thing, but there's a lot more that I want to talk to you about, specifically this New York Times editorial that you wrote recently about Ocasio-Cortez, and even more broadly kind of what the left needs to do about foreign policy. So thanks for joining me. I hope we get to all that.
Oh, yeah. I look forward to it. And just, of course, a reminder to all listeners, writers don't choose their headlines.
Right.
So I in no way intend to have come off as wanting to lecture Ocasio-Cortez, a project that I have no interest in doing. I'm not here to lecture anyone, let alone a exciting politician who might actually do things for our movement.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that they smack that mansplainy kind of headline on there.
Yeah, it was a bit mansplaining for sure.
But that's what gets the clicks, man. Yeah.
This is what's so interesting. It's like when I first saw that, I'm like, oh, interesting. But I think it really helped it get clicks.
Yeah.
So we live in this like interesting environment where you slap this sort of like an interrogative headline and then a picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and it gets people to click. So I'm glad they did it in the end.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great, and it gets the article is a really great like primer, I think, and a beginning. It reminded me of like I don't know, it reminded me of stuff that actually came out of the anti-war movement of the 60s, which was kind of like policy papers that were just kind of bullet points, and there's some really great ideas in there. So yeah, what was the impetus for writing that article? Because as much as I framed it, and I think the New York Times framed it as an Ocasio-Cortez thing, it's not really about her. It's much more kind of a reaction to a trend you're noticing about foreign policy in the left. So how did that come about?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think I, like probably most listeners of this podcast, was a Bernie supporter in 2016,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things I think it's difficult to deny is that it was pretty clear that foreign policy was not Bernie's interest, even though I think he's been getting much better on it in recent months. He's been sort of promoting a particular foreign policy vision and what he thinks that a left-wing movement to do going forward. But in 2016, it certainly wasn't a big thing. And then if people will recall, there was an interview that Ocasio-Cortez gave a little bit after she was elected, where she basically punted on the Israel-Palestine question. It was clear that she hadn't particularly thought about it very much, and that it wasn't of central interest, which is fine. Not everything has to be of central interest, but it was surprising that there wasn't even sort of a party line.
Yeah.
Like what is the left's position? Like not the Democratic liberal left, but the actual, what I would call the socialist left or the true left wing. Like what's the party line on Israel Palestine?
Especially because the Israel Palestine, and I include myself, but I know there are many others. Israel Palestine, to me in my mind, was always a central issue of the left. It was almost like an entry point into the left. to understand the Israel situation was was actually the line between liberal and left. And so to see Ocasio-Cortez and other figures kind of have a muddled vision of what their politics is around Israel kind of was confusing to me.
And I think it's really a reflection or an artifact of the fact that the DSA and really just the broad left, generally speaking, has just gotten a lot of new recruits in the last few years, which is a great thing. Like, I think that the left for too long in the United States has fetishized being kind of a marginal movement. And in my opinion, at least, and people might disagree, I think it's great that there are so many people who are really entering into it. But at this point, then we've got to kind of boil down our principles into a not like talking points per se, but like a series of principles around which we could organize our thinking on foreign policy. Because if you'll notice, the op-ed doesn't really have many specific policy proposals. It has some broad ones like, reinstate the Iran nuclear deal, the nuclear agreement, join the International Criminal Court, and rejoin the Paris Accords. But for the most part, it's really a series of principles. And what I wanted to do is begin just the conversation about what is it that we as a left distinguishes us, what distinguishes us from the democratic the liberal center and the liberal right. And so what I thought was it might be useful not to have, a 40-page document about the specific policies, although those things are useful and should come later, but just what are our values? What type of values should we bring to foreign policy and foreign policy making? And what are these values in light of the realities of the failed foreign policies of the last 20, 30 years? And what's always really interesting to me, David, I don't know if you've recently read Chomsky's, I'm sure you've read it before, The Responsibility of Intellectuals from 1967. But what's really interesting is that piece ends with a call for like third world developmentalism, essentially, which is that like the United States should start pumping money into what was then called the third world, what we now call the global south, which is really interesting because I think you would be hard pressed to find a leftist today who would think that the American developmentalist project was anything but pretty destructive. It did help in certain cases, and we could go into specifics on that, but like as a general project, didn't really succeed in what it was intending to do. So the question is, what does the left do given the obvious failures of American power? And that's what really spurred me to write this op-ed.
Cool. And just to go over really quickly your kind of main areas and values that you're locating, like, and I want to hear kind of like where you got these values, because I mean, to me, it's like you're kind of picking up on a wider history of left wing politics. But you've got like democracy, accountability, anti-militarism, and threat deflation, and internationalism. All these categories, and we can get to all of them specifically. But where did you how did you boil those? Where did those values come from? In other words, because you look at like the anti-war movement of the 1960s and 70s and around the Vietnam War. It's like a pretty there were big organizations like the National Mobilization or SDS is probably the one that gets the most attention in the histories, but either way, they didn't really agree on a broad set of values. There was a lot of disagreement. So how did you kind of figure out that these were kind of the main values that the left should pursue when it comes to foreign policy?
No, sure. And I think it's really important because to emphasize the importance particularly of the first two values, which are very much focused on domestic politics, because the piece got picked up by what might be termed IR circles, and particularly realists who really seem to have enjoyed the piece. But I think that it's interesting because they didn't really focus on the first two.
Yeah.
But they focused on the final, really the third and the fourth point, which is anti-militarism and threat deflation. But to me, the first two are the foundation of any foreign policy. So in my view, and people might disagree, I'm very much not a vanguardist and very much not a Leninist. I think democracy is the only font from which a left-wing movement could arise. And I'm very much an egalitarian. I'm very much an equalitarian in the sense that I think that there's democratic structures and that the people, literally the demos, from which sovereignty in American society is supposed to come, should be the ones in some meaningful way, not just a public opinion poll, but in a meaningful way, having an effect on foreign policy making. And this very much has not been the case. I'm most familiar with a period really after 1898 and even more after 1945. But from what I know of the earlier period, it's not nothing, is that the people, quote unquote, capital P people, have rarely had an impact on foreign policy. And this doesn't even take into account that many of the people, such as African Americans and women, were denied the franchise. And even after some populations were granted the franchise, like after the Civil War, were completely denied it anyway in practice. So that's not even considering that. Even like white property owners very rarely had much of an impact on foreign policy. So from the very beginning of the Republic, foreign policy has been an elitist affair. And particularly after World War II, when we created, as I talked about in my last nostalgia trap, this institutional infrastructure, right? The CIA, the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, that is very consciously undemocratic in the sense that it's headquartered in the executive and the people have very little impact on anything that the United States empire has done abroad. And I think it's been really, actually, there's this tragic perspective, whereas if I think you asked the average American 12-year-old who just completed like their 6th, 7th, or 8th grade civics course, they would have no idea that the United States has 800 bases abroad, right? So there's this complete disconnect between the people who live in what I would say is an empire in the United States and people who live abroad who understand what America does in the world. So there's just been complete separation of domestic and foreign policy, which I think it was actually reflected somewhat negatively in Ocasio-Cortez's responses to the Israel-Palestine question, or even Bernie's lack of interest in 2016. Again, I think it's really changing.
Well, I mean,
in foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of what the is happening with the whatever you want to call the rising left right now, democratic socialism, the DSA, Brooklyn, all that stuff. It seems like it's it's focused and on domestic economic issues primarily. And the kind of things like that, that's why there are so many young people, at least that's the conventional wisdom, right, is that there are so many young people coming into the DSA these days because they kind of are living the economic reality of millennial life in 2018 America. And so foreign policy is not on the docket in their minds in the same way it would be for even the generation of left people that came before that came of age during the during the Bush years and the Iraq War and all of that. And foreign policy for me was kind of, like I mentioned with Israel, it was kind of the central place that I kind of understood the power structures of America and exactly what you're talking about when it comes to democracy, feeling like I'm completely powerless. Even going out in the street 15 million strong, is not going to change the minds at all. And even Nixon very specifically said this after the October moratoriums that I was going to just mention that. This stuff's not going to affect me at all, and it didn't. Although there are people that make an argument, and I think sometimes I'm sympathetic to their argument that the anti-war movement was in the 1960s was a force that Nixon was very concerned with, and I think it switched. It helped the war switch to bombing. Yeah, I mean that's what definitely. I would say was one of the major, and I guess that's not nothing, but I mean there were quite a few million dead Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians who, it's still, the fact that they basically ended, I mean, the war, not to get into the details, but it basically switched to a bombing campaign in the late 60s, early 70s. And so there was a lot less protests after that because people were actually not getting drafted. So you were able to kind of retreat into your and they ended the draft too.
Bourgeois life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they ended the draft in '73, and even exactly. and this is something that has come up with Nate Bethea and a few other military people we've had on the show, which is that begins a larger kind of separation of war and foreign affairs from the population, that there was a more in definitely in the World War II era, and Vietnam I think is really the break, where the American public is just completely kept out of this shit. And it's weird because it's the American public is still has this fealty to the American war machine. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
When you think about I know you've probably seen it. We could probably bring it up on YouTube. But the speech that Jack Nicholson gives in A Few Good Men, where he's you want me on that line, you need me on that line. I feel like a lot of Americans have basically internalized that. That there's this force that's quote unquote keeping us safe, and even if there are 800 bases, it's not imperialism. That's just what America does, and it's kind of a symptom of what you're talking about here, this separation.
Right, and I think it's also important just to say that when I say 800 bases, it's also put that in comparative perspective. Russia, for example, has somewhere between 21 and 40 bases, and it's probably closer to 21. Right, so this is what we're talking about here. It's not even an order of magnitude; it's orders of magnitude toward against our supposed enemies, right? Against these other great powers. So it's just an enormous orders of magnitude difference. And I think you're right. I think the AVF the all-volunteer force. Even though the military didn't necessarily want it at the time, it's turned out to be one of the greatest gifts to American militarism possible by totally separating the population from any stake in managing the empire. And of course, this also has to do with class, because who winds up becoming basically the janissary class, the warrior class? It's essentially poor Americans.
Yeah.
Right, poor Americans, mostly of minority, of what's considered now a minority background. Hopefully, will no longer be minority going forward. But basically, poor Black Americans, poor Latinx Americans, et cetera, and also poor Americans from the South. Right, so we're creating this warrior class that is essentially keeping America's military going, when especially most Americans, but especially the bourgeoisie and especially the elites like Kavanaugh, all these chicken hawks in the administration, are totally disconnected from any of the personal effects of war: PTSD, losing a limb, having to commit horrible acts because some commander commanded you to. And so it's an enormous problematic. So I think democracy, in the sense that people need to be brought seriously in to this fact, this reality of American empire.
And how do we do that? I mean, it seems like, I talked about, like, this feeling of powerlessness under the Bush regime, and it feels even more so now. And when I say powerlessness, I feel like, the armor is up, and they're like kind of, pulling the drawbridge over the moat kind of thing. And it feels like even more impenetrable. Like we have this moment happening this week that I know, I've seen some of your posts on social media, so I know you've been sickened by the Kavanaugh nomination process too. But like this moment where like you have this kind of like literal like groups of, I mean, this woman is coming into it's just an extraordinary moment where like a woman is coming into the chambers of Congress to describe this sexual assault and really raw, unbelievably sensitive material, and the Republicans don't seem to give a fuck at all. They're like basically like, this is a lie. They're attacking her, and they're gonna. I think. I mean, I could be wrong. We don't have predictions yet, but I think they're gonna pass him through, and he's gonna go to the Supreme Court. So when you have that feeling of like, God, what do we need to do to actually shift this system? I wonder what your ideas are, how we do that with foreign policy.
I think that's crucial, and I think one of the most disgusting scenes in American history have been those senators apologizing to Kavanaugh.
Yes,
that really turned my stomach. That's sickening that they had the gall to apologize to that person when he was getting when he was forced to answer for his clearly. For his actions that he had taken as a teenager. No, and I think that's a really good question, right? And this is the question. What I proposed in the piece, or what wound up making it into the final piece, was essentially asserting Congress's role, but that's not even great, because as you know, it very well might be that Congress might be even more militaristic than the imperial executive we have now. So for me, right. I think this is. Yeah, I mean, it's no, like, why would Paul Ryan all of a sudden, not build bases? It doesn't make any sense, and particularly the fact of the pork that comes to so many congressional districts by having these military installations building planes that'll never be used, or having these bases that bring in enormous amounts of money, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right.
So I think. Yeah, so it's an enormous problem, and it's one to take incredibly seriously. For me, I think the first project ultimately has to be educational, and in that sense, maybe I'm an old school Dewey. And again, I just don't think revolution works. I just don't think vanguardism works. So I'm very much not a violent revolutionary by any stretch of the imagination. So essentially, the left has to dedicate itself to an educational project, and in some sense, we have to have a much more expansive understanding of what it means to be a socialist and to be in a socialist movement. It's not just to vote. The idea that democracy is defined by voting is a post-war idea. It's a very limited understanding of democracy. It has to be with total understanding of civic participation in organizations like DSA. But DSA should only be considered one aspect of the socialist movement. There should be like socialist civic organizations, socialist educational organizations. Organizations that are really be able to create civic communities so that people have a broader understanding and solidarities about what the United States does abroad. So that's step one. Step two is just the policy process. And this is where I think many people would disagree. There was a very interesting post on Fellow Traveler's blog, which is dedicated to creating a left-wing foreign policy that is against the idea of, for example, a left-wing think tank, because basically all these sorts of left-wing ideas need to come from a grassroots organization, the socialist movement. And while I'm sympathetic to that, I just think historically it's not how power operates in the present institutional arrangement of the United States. So if you're not a revolutionary, and I'm not a revolutionary, then you have to work within these particular institutional models that presently exist. So I would say, yes, you do create socialist think tanks. You do try to get, let's say Bernie wins you do try to get on the NSC or try to get socialists on the NSC, so they're at least able to say, "Don't drop those bombs," right? So I mean, at least there should be someone there who's saying, "Do you drone strike?" And when the military comes in and says there's going to be another 9/11, President Sanders, there's going to be another 9/11 unless you drone strike these 15 areas in Afghanistan or Pakistan, someone should be there and say no. Someone should be there and say, listen, there might be another terrorist attack, but that's a consequence of modernity, and there's no such thing as zero risk. Right. So, I mean, so I would say you have the grassroots educational program while you also create what might be termed an elitist program to get policymakers in there who will say, no, don't drop those bombs. Yes. Don't build those bases, bring those bases home, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one. And feel free to disagree. I mean, I think.
Hey, I mean, it sounds great. It all sounds great in theory. I want to ask you why you're not a revolutionary. What's wrong with you? We're in a revolutionary moment. But you know, I don't even know what that really means when I say revolutionary, because I'm kind of like, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I go to my job every day and I try to like pay my rent, and that's what we're all doing. And it's kind of weird. It's weird that so many people strike that kind of revolutionary pose right now, because there's, you know, the structure of the American government is as powerful as ever before. It seems like,
right.
Yeah, and so in terms of the disagreement, I don't think I disagree with anything you're saying. I think these are all great ideas. I just wonder about, like, you know, how feasible they are in terms of, like, I don't know, training an elite class, especially like the idea of like, I think the socialist education idea is great. Like, you know, and I don't know if the word socialist like necessarily needs to be in it even. Like,
right, it might not need to be.
Yeah, just a project to kind of educate the American people. I mean, that's what the teach-ins were doing, you know, very early on about the Vietnam War, were literally just about like kind of telling people what's going on. So that part of it, right. I understand, and as an educator, I can get behind. But like, I don't know, when I think about like training elite dudes and ladies to go in and like kind of be the people that say no, I'm like, once you reach those elite institutions, haven't you already like swallowed the values, you know? And like, how do we, in other words, I mean, this was a Daniel Ellsberg question, right? It was like, how do you kind of like still maintain a conscience and climb that ladder and be in the Pentagon, you know?
Right. I think it ultimately has to, I mean, you could only do it if there's like a Bernie in power, right? You can't do it if there's a Trump in power or an Obama in power. And I think that's why ultimately, unfortunately, at this moment, American electoralism is actually really critical, even though if it's not the long-term solution, right? So I think the question is for people today, like you and I, is like, what do we do given the historical realities of America in 2018? In my opinion, it's not late imperial Russia during World War I. Right?
Yeah, right.
This is why a violent revolution was able to succeed, because so many of the Russian masses were starving. There was like a 30-year-long like anti-czarist movement. Like the crimes of the czar were just so terrible that you were able to have a Bolshevik revolution. And also, like, that might not have succeeded, but for a variety of historical contingencies during the Civil War of the late teens and early 20s. It was kind of amazing that they were able to succeed in power. So the question is, if you don't think that's on the docket or in the cards for Americans in 2018, what do you do?
Yeah, I mean,
and there are going to be tensions and there are going to be problems.
Yeah, I guess you know, you've got your politics to me, and I think my politics are similar in the sense of like they don't really fall into a you know, one particular like sectarian category. You know, you're not like a doctrinaire socialist or anything like that. But at the same time,
no, we're historians.
Yeah,
that's right.
But it seems like at the same time would you describe yourself as like an anti-imperialist?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think imperialism, it was actually interesting. A little note. The anti-militarism point was originally anti-imperialism.
Oh, that's interesting. So that was a change in the editing room.
That was a change. I mean, I think it was ultimately a good change, because I think too many people, if they read that, they would have just turned off. Yeah. And so, you know, I wasn't writing for Jacobin. You know, in these times, I was writing for the New York Times. And so that's just the reality. No, but I'm absolutely an anti-imperialist. I mean, my social vision, I mean, to be honest, is some sort of world governance organization. If it's some sort of socialist utopian world governance organization.
Did George Soros pay you to say that?
Yes, George Soros. He paid me to say absolutely.
It's funny to hear you say straight out like, oh, I want like a one world government, because that's like it's like that is the right wing fear. Like literally, that's their conspiracy theory since the Goldwater days, right? Is that there's like a coming like one world government that and to hear you say it explicitly is funny.
Well, but it's interesting because like it would ultimately be cosmopolitan. It wouldn't be like a Maoist, you know, or Stalinist thing. I mean, and also that's a project that's going to be, you know, it's more Star Trek Maoist, in my opinion. That would be the ideal. And then the question is, how do you build these sorts of transnational solidarities at this moment? For me, the United States could start doing that with Mexico and Canada, right? Where Mexico no longer serves as like this sort of outsource of cheap and exploited labor, and the fact that these awful drug war killings going on right now, but you would be able to build these sorts of transnational solidarities where the United States would have to give up some of its sovereignty, but for the greater humanist good. I mean, ultimately, I'm a humanist. I think there's more that unites human beings in the final analysis, to use the old Marxian term, than divides us. And I think that we should be working to build those solidarities across borders, across cultures, et cetera, et cetera. And that, to me, would be the ultimate goal. And imperialism, in my mind, it stands in fundamental opposition to that, because imperialism is the assertion of one nation's sovereignty or one political community's sovereignty over another.
And the roots of imperialism are, there are a lot of them, but nationalism was one of them. So where are you on the nationalism thing in terms of like, I mean, I guess if you're suggesting a one world government, then you're not seeing this through a nationalist lens, really. I guess my what I wonder is kind of like whose face is on the money, you know what I mean? Kind of
right,
like,
for sure,
that sort of thing.
No, I mean, so the real question I think you're asking, and tell me if I'm wrong, is like, I think obviously most people of our political inklings would be anti-nationalist philosophically.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you use nationalism as sort of an ideological tool in order to start building the community you want to see at home?
Yeah.
Right. So like when Bernie starts making nationalist appeals, I don't think that's necessarily foolish, because this is a difference between philosophical and political thinking, and they're not the same, in my opinion.
I think that's really, I think it's important to point out. And I mean, the other day I kind of was talking about Ted Cruz getting heckled in a restaurant. You know what I mean? And
right.
and the point I was trying to make, and I don't think I did it well because it's Twitter, and so it's hard to make a nuanced point. But the point I was trying to make was that, I love people heckling Ted Cruz in restaurants. Like, I think that like philosophically and aesthetically, I love seeing him and his
it's
wife.
A beautiful scene.
Yeah, it's awesome. I'm like, please throw food at him, spit on him, whatever. I love it. But at the same time, I was just pointing out that politically, I think it's probably bad strategy. Like, it's not gonna really help Beto O'Rourke win. And in fact, he like disavowed the whole thing anyway.
Right, as he has to.
Right.
If Beto O'Rourke wants to be senator of Texas, he also, the same thing with the kneeling. He has to say like good people on both sides.
Right.
I mean, that's politics.
Right.
I'm sorry, but that's politics.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to be like a liberal hand wringer that thinks it's like horrible that people are yelling at people at restaurants. That's not my point at all. I love the uncivility. I think we need more of it. But at the same time,
I agree.
And at the same time, and that's kind of what I think the balance that you're striking a little bit is kind of like, the larger project on the one hand, but also the reality of electoral politics and the reality of kind of the structures we're working with today.
Yeah, and I think that comes through with the liberal hand wringing over things like the college seat platforming, which in my opinion, I'm surprised that people are so anti that, even on the liberal side, because it's essentially the democratic community changing speech codes, which to me just seems like a natural historical process. Like, things that were acceptable in 1850 are not acceptable in 2018, and how that's ultimately democratically and historically decided. So I don't understand all the hand wringing by people like John Chait. I mean, I guess he's sort of just a red baiter, but even more serious people whom I respect. Like, I just don't see it, because isn't that just the demos deciding what's no longer acceptable? And and it's not a surprise that so many people of the intellectual dark web are essentially middle-aged white guys who have never had to confront the fact that not everyone agrees with what they have to say, and that there are other political communities and various identitarian communities that disagree with them, and they're expressing themselves in a democratic way, which involves coming out in force and saying this is not okay. I don't understand why people are against that personally.
Yeah, and you're talking about like people thinking that like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro are having their speech restricted or something like that, when it's like
right, and that's just democracy.
Yeah, that's just
in my opinion.
It doesn't feel that way to them, I guess. If it doesn't feel like the demos decided that. It's more something like some college kids have made up their minds that they don't want to listen to me, so they're not going to, and that's an infringement on my speech, which is a crazy thing to think.
No, yeah, it's absolutely not. It's absolutely not. They're allowed to speech, but if the demos comes out and says, no, we don't want you to speak, democracy is the fundamental value.
Yeah.
It's changing speech codes, right? They shouldn't be put in prison. They shouldn't be prosecuted by the state.
Well, I don't know about that.
The problem is once you start putting people in prison, if someone else rules, then you're eventually the guy in prison.
Well, yeah, there's the difference between the kind of the sentiment and the politics, right?
As Bukharin himself learned in 1937,
That's right?
I mean, so this is the issue. But I think it's just a community that had by community I mean people like Shapiro, Harris, Jordan Peterson, et cetera, that has just never been told that what they said is not in the democratic interest, because we're finally seeing come online these new democratic political constituencies, which to me is amazing.
Do you think
it's a total positive thing?
Do you think those guys are like? I mean, and I'll throw in like the person that I think is like kind of giving them their main platform is like Joe Rogan. Like Joe, you know, he presents and he's really popular. You know, and I understand why. I mean, I've listened to a lot of the show and watched a lot of the programs, and like I see why people, especially like young males, respond to the kind of conversations he's
young
having.
American males.
Yeah, and you know, I say this because my students generally are big Joe Rogan fans. A lot of my the dudes in my classes like ask me about Joe Rogan episodes and things like that. But it's like, you know, he has this kind of approach where he's like, I feel I don't know if you feel the same way, but it feels disingenuous for him to be like, I'm just open-minded and I don't have an agenda, when it feels like there's like a kind of continuity to the type of people that he's having on the show all the time, and that seems like those people, even though they profess to kind of just be free thinkers or something like that, they have an agenda.
Well, I mean, and you'll agree with me here. I mean, this is just this naive idea that quote unquote capital R rationality is a non-historical process, or that someone like Joe Rogan, is able to sort of put himself above history and escape from the various historical contingencies that have made him who he is. And so this is like my major problem with people like Harris and I don't listen to Rogan that much or really at all. But my major problem with people like Harris, who I've heard speak for many years at this point, is that he thinks that literally it's one of the most naive epistemological claims that one could possibly make, but that there's such a thing as capital R reason that is above history.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is just not correct. And so I think that what people like Rogan, what you're saying, it sounds like Rogan does, or people like Harris do, is that they equate their specific positionality in society and their specific historical place as being reasonable, capital R. And they've never been challenged on it. And that's why you see them throwing such fits these days about why they're not being listened to, because they have a very naive understanding of reason and rationality, and I would say anti-historical. And as you know, Americans love being considering themselves to be outside of history, from the 1630 John Winthrop speech about being a city on a hill.
Yeah, totally. I love that connection. It's like, you know, and these guys are looking at it from like, I think the appeal of it, and I say this because I was kind of, you know, drawn into not these guys, but they kind of like earlier there was, you know, like 2012 mysticism and a lot of that stuff that was happening like in the early 2000s. Terrence McKenna, and you know, for me, my lethal combination was like Terrence McKenna and Noam Chomsky. But like, but these guys have taken it like that perspective of like, you know, we're aliens kind of looking at humanity and we're kind of above it all. In other words, they kind of remove themselves, and that's what they think reason is like remove it. And they're not really, I mean, anyone who knows anything knows you know, it's absurd to say you can remove yourself that way. Like,
no, you can't. You just can't.
It's impossible. Yeah. And it's really arrogant as shit to do that too. Like, it's just like, I hate the Jordan Peterson is basically like, you know, I have no particular agenda. I'm just calling it like I see it. Like, that's his basic like tack on things, and it's bullshit. Like, it's total bullshit. Like, you have a perspective. Like, these guys don't really they rail against postmodern like discourse, but they don't even seem to understand what it is. And if they did, they would understand like that they're full of shit.
Yeah, no, I think it's an anti-historical position. So what you're saying, essentially, David, is that you agree with everything Avital Ronell has ever written.
Yes. Holy Lord. Yeah.
That's a whole other conversation about sort of that.
You know what? That's funny. That case kind of like was huge and it dropped off. I think it's just gotten uglier. You know, a lot of academics threw themselves on the sword for her.
Academics of a certain generation. So I think who are also similarly blinkered by their own historical positionality. Yeah. Right. Where they can't see like different types of oppression. And that's why I brought it up, because like all of these, like basically what happens is all of these revolutionary positions eventually turn into the status quo. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And so that's why I brought up sort of the postmodernist idea, because you have all these very famous postmodernists, but I think important as I think it was Andrew Chu's his or her name. I don't know how they identify or what they said was about how like they had basically become what they critiqued in this power elite. right? That considers themselves sort of above history.
Yeah.
And I think that's a certain thing. It's just, we're all, I think the most the fundamental thing that people have to recognize about their own existence is that we're all in the stream of history.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And just to for the listeners that don't know what we're talking about, this is like a case at NYU where a really well-known professor named Avital Ronell, a well-known kind of radical postmodernist, I would say, in terms of what her discourse has been, but she's she's been accused of in a very serious case of like basically sexually harassing and psychologically harassing a graduate.
Psychological abuse.
Yeah. For years and years, and all this came out, and a bunch of like the big names in like postmodern theory came out to support her. Despite the
most
fact
famously Judith Butler.
Yeah, well, and Zizek too, I think, as I understand it.
That's not surprising.
Yeah, that motherfucker. Has Zizek written anything like original in the last like 10 years or something like that?
No, I would say it goes back even longer. Yeah. Zizek has become again a parody of himself. In my opinion.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
Because and I say that sucks because I think he's like kind of an electrifying figure that had the potential to like kind of bring really complicated ideas to the masses.
But he became part of the bourgeois elite. I mean, that's literally what he became. He was totally domesticated, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, what he's had, like, he's on like his third supermodel wife or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Who's like far younger than him, so the power relationships in there must be quite
it's
interesting.
fucked up. The pictures they always look like posters for like some sort of like Slovenian reboot of Beauty and the Beast.
Right. Well, I don't know what you think. I think Zizek and Melania should run as a Slovakian, Slovenian, sort of Eastern European ticket in 2020. But
oh god,
it doesn't get more postmodern than that.
Jeez, yeah, and so there's this kind of like that postmodern kind of idea, and especially as it's been kind of expressed in the academy, is something that's kind of leaking into the real world, in ways that like we're not really expected. Like Trump is like, and this came up on the if anyone wants to go back and listen to another Daniel Traber, our episode a little bit a few episodes back. He's we talked a lot about this the kind of idea that like Trump is this kind of postmodern figure that is actually like playing the postmodern ideas really brilliantly without really being aware of them at all.
No, I think that's that's absolutely true, and but I think this also raises interesting questions about truth. So David, just as a historian, do you think we could reach truth or approach truth, or no? I'm curious what you think.
It's like capital T truth.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't. And
no, neither do I.
Yeah.
So I think we're in this moment where I think historians at least think that we could kind of approach it.
Yeah.
Like
it's
we
like,
don't
what
think,
are we doing then? If we're like
equal?
if we don't believe in truth, I think that you're hitting on something really important, because like in the historical, like in the discourse, and like or in the discipline of history in like graduate programs, like there's not a lot of postmodern stuff in there. Like
we're totally we're post theory. I mean, it's just the entire discipline has just decided to say like, no, we're just not interested in theory,
right?
Which is a really interesting move. So like the postmodern critique was made, and historians have essentially said, okay, but basically, what are we going to do?
I'm still going to use evidence to try to prove things.
Exactly. Yeah. We return to the archive. It's also very similar in anthropology, where anthropology is now united essentially around a method, because no one believes they're developing a science of capital M man, and to use that specifically patriarchal term. So now they're just kind of organized around this method of ethnography, and historians are kind of now organized around the space of the archive. So it's actually a really interesting moment in the humanities writ large. Is like after this postmodernism, we've basically returned to method.
Yeah,
as the recourse.
And what do you think of that? Because I mean, for me, it's like the postmodern stuff is really, really important, and it like for me, like it's not only important, it's where I began. I mean, I studied film studies at UC Santa Barbara, and I was lucky enough to have professors in the undergrad years give me things like Foucault and Derrida and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of already had that stuff in my head, and once you have it in your head, it's hard to go back. You're talking about like capital T truth, and like I don't know, even just like death of the author, that kind of stuff like really resonates with me, and I still believe it. So it's like and I asked this question because I don't know myself, like what the fuck are we doing then as historians? If we have internalized the idea that there is no capital T truth. I guess it's just that, like you say, we're just like circling the wagons and approaching it.
Right. I think we have that, but I don't know if you agree with this, but I also think we've actually seen ironically a return to like American pragmatism and instrumentality, where we essentially say our narratives have political purpose. And I think you see this most explicitly in the whole Nancy MacLean thing, right? Like her book was like very clearly politically designed and was designed in order to take down the Koch network, essentially, or to equate libertarianism with racism. And that's a position, you know, like this return to instrumental reason, you know, this return to 1920s, 1930s John Dewey type stuff.
Yeah.
And so I see. I don't know where we'll go, but it just doesn't seem to be like back in the 90s and 2000s, sort of the new cultural history and sort of this turn to theory. It's just been completely abandoned, and it doesn't seem to be like another theory is going to take off like postmodern theory did in the 90s. You know, post-colonial theory had a little bit of a moment in the early 2000s with provincializing Europe. Chakrabarty, who himself apparently has lots of problems around power and sexual relationships as well, from what I've heard. So there's these. It's a really interesting moment for the discipline, and this is what I see, which is actually really interesting, and why I say that turn to instrumental reason is that to me it's not surprising that many of the leading young editors of sort of these lefty magazines, like Bhaskar Sunkara, was a history major, studied under Leo Rebuffo, an intellectual historian at George Washington. Tim Schenck, one of the new editors of Dissent, is a PhD in history from Columbia University. I'm a historian. I've been publishing in public. Stephen Wertheim's also a PhD in history. He's been doing a lot of public. Christy Thornton is another historian. So it's not a surprise that my generation, our generation of historians, yourself, you're running this popular podcast, which is totally a history thing. Thad Russell, whose podcast I just did, is a history. That's right. Is a historian. So you have this turn amongst our generation.
He was on the show a while ago. Long time ago,
right?
Yeah. I mean, is that also though is that like alt-ac? You know what I mean? Like partly like it's partly like an expression of the fact that and I think this is something that people are shocked by that don't know this, that are outside of the academy, that don't know to understand how the academic labor market works and how it has been working for a long time under the kind of neoliberal university. But I I teach a class at a lifelong learning institute over at Cal State Channel Islands currently, and there are a lot of the students in the class. It's a lifelong learning institute, so they're all over 75 years old, and they don't understand that I'm doing this in part because,
not out of the goodness of your heart,
because
not just out of
I mean, I love talking to them. I love these classes. It's actually kind of amazing to talk to that population about the Great Depression and American politics and things like that. But, they're always shocked to hear me say that, I'm here in part because there are no full-time jobs for historians, particularly American historians, and the job market has kind of fallen off. I mean, I think that the people there's a recent scandal of because it's the job market season right now, that the MLA, the Modern Language Association, they do English, American Studies, that kind of thing. People they're experiencing their own crash right now. There weren't a lot of jobs on the job market right now, and I'm welcome to the club, because the AHA and the other major historical associations, their jobs lists have grown to, or have dwindled down to next to nothing. And if you notice, a lot of them they're not full-time tenure track jobs anymore. They're part-time jobs and kind of half-paid internships and a lot of fellowships and stuff like that. But it's awful. The market is awful for historians. So when you say oh, I'm hosting a podcast, or historians are out in the world, that's partly expression of the economy for historians.
I think you're completely right. And just to tie it all together to our previous discussion, my brilliant friend Julian Gans, who's co-chair of Seattle DSA, when the whole Avital Ronell thing was happening, he's this is a totally political economic thing. This guy didn't get a job. The guy who accused her, I forget his name, unfortunately, but one of the reasons he accused her is because he's been on the market for 4 fucking years. He endured years and years of psychological and sexual abuse, and he didn't even wind up getting a job in the end. So what I think part of the Me Too Time's Up sort of stuff in academia is spurred by the fact that there's all these angry students who have been doing these things for years and have been suffering the sort of hierarchical medieval relationships of graduate school, and they're not even rewarded with a job. So in my opinion, I will not be surprised if in the next 3 to 5 years an entire generation of abused academics, of historians and particularly in humanities, anthropologists, etc. Language people are going to start coming out against their graduate advisors who treated them like shit.
Yeah, and
so it's a totally political economic thing.
And there's also just like, I mean, and this kind of template of labor in academia is really, no different from what's happening in other industries across the United States, which is,
right.
This idea. But I wonder, like, what's going to happen to all these highly trained individuals, and I include myself. I mean, we can't all have fucking podcasts. It's like,
right.
What are we going to do? Because there's going to be this class of highly trained humanities people mainly who are like trying to make a living outside of the academy, and there's really not, there's only so many museums and things, like that. There's not really,
right.
And I can tell you, I've been doing this for a long time, and I did the museum thing. I did a museum thing for about 5 years, but you have to have the museum. The museum world is a small one, and it's a tough one,
right.
and it's not, and it's also, you're not necessarily trained to do that kind of work.
No, it's not professional academic research.
Right.
I mean, and this is what Aaron Bartram's whole thing is.
That's right.
It's that like we talk about alt-ac, and really we're not. First of all, we don't want to be alt-ac, and I don't think, even though we live in this awful capital system, that necessarily like we should totally ignore what people actually want to do with their lives. So there's that. I mean, people want to be professional researchers, and that should be taken seriously. But also, like you said, there's not enough jobs, and I think it's an enormous problem. And just to bring it back to my research, is that interestingly, a lot of the arguments that the first exiles from Nazi Germany made in the 30s was that the reason that Nazis were able to succeed is because there was actually a jobs crisis in German academia in the 20s, where like there's an entire generation that basically didn't get academic jobs, and a high percentage of them joined the Nazis.
Oh,
right?
wow.
Not that that's going to happen. Yeah, which is really, if you go back to Social Research, which was a journal of the New School for Social Research, and basically published Exile stuff. There's several articles in there that basically lead the rise of intellectual Nazis into the jobs crisis of the 20s.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
But that goes along with the kind of idea that like the Nazis, were like the middle class professionals, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the Nazis, they basically got a lot of support from a lot of sectors of the population. And in my view, the ultimate promise of Nazism to Germans was that they essentially were arguing to replace the class system of German society with a racial caste system, so that if you were Aryan, no matter what class you were able to be above the sort of lower races. And I think a lot of historians think that was the fundamental cross-class appeal of Nazism, why it was able to appeal from everyone from a Prussian Junker to a working class guy in Berlin or girl in Berlin.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. So hopefully we all don't become Nazis, but I think it's interesting that we're losing what to me is more important is this enormous font of knowledge.
Yep.
There's so many books that are not going to be written. There are so many students that are going to be taught by overworked, underpaid professors who are just moving from one adjunct position to the next. And so the American people, to go back to that nationalism question, we live in a world of nations. Americans writ large are going to suffer. Yeah. And it's really a shame that this isn't considered to be an enormous social problem. It's an enormous social problem.
Yeah. And it's been for a very long time, and we've talked about it many times in this on this program, with the idea that education and teachers have been under attack, both rhetorically and practically, for basically my entire life.
By the worst segments of society, by like finance guys.
Well, I remember
people who literally.
I remember growing up in the 80s and having those fucking bumper stickers that that said it'll be a great day when we have to the military has to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber, and teachers have everything they need. I don't know if you remember that, but
I do.
Yeah. So, but the idea is so that's the 80s, and that's my entire life for the last several decades has been this decline that I don't see turning around. And that's disappointing. I don't know what I was thinking getting into education, because it feels like there are people that I've heard in the university say it's going to turn around, and there's going to be a bunch of history jobs coming, and I'm just kind of like, what is the evidence for that? I don't see it.
There are history jobs, they're just not tenure track.
Right.
I mean, there's plenty of. I mean, this is the whole thing about structure. There's plenty of students to teach, and in fact, there have been more and more history jobs probably created in the last 30 years than ever before. But structurally, they're underpaid in their adjunct positions because they're exploiting all this labor, because we don't have like this national history union, essentially. For example, why aren't professors at all these universities going on strikes? Right? There's such a lack of solidarity amongst the people who are in the position of power to actually do to actually make this better. And, that's a consciousness raising thing. And there are glimmers of hope, like the West Virginia teacher strike in Seattle. There was a threat of a teacher strike, which led to a 10% raise for the public school teachers. But it hasn't really infiltrated higher education, except at the graduate student level.
Yeah. And
And
think of how, like, just think of what the word graduate student means to Americans that aren't associated with, like, academia. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
The Simpsons, they make fun of them.
Right. Exactly. And so, like, when you hear, like, the graduate students are on strike, like, we're going uphill in terms of public opinion. You know what I mean? Like, it feels like,
to say the least.
Yeah. And not even mentioning the kind of wider decline of unions, not only as like a real thing, but as a kind of way of life and an understood element of American citizenship is like, being part of a union and not only like just paying the dues, but actually like participating in the life of the union. A union that used to have like culture to it, etc. So all of that being gone, it seems like the grad student unions are just the ultimate underdogs in a lot of ways. I think the public has more sympathy for those teachers, like public school teachers that are teaching little kids. You know what I mean?
Right. And it's so ironic because, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but as a child, you're told to sort of pursue your passion, pursue something that'll give back to the community. At least that's part of a message.
Yeah.
That's in American culture. And so the people who actually do that, who actually, who decide not to pursue banking, who decide not to pursue the law or whatever it may be, and who decide to actually pursue the pursuit of knowledge as a career are basically shat upon by the larger culture and society.
Yeah.
Right. So it's this tragic thing, like very, very intelligent people and dedicated people and people who are emotionally with the world are just totally disregarded by society and thrown on the trash heap. It's an enormous social problem as far as I'm concerned, and that there really needs to be like politicians talking about it. Like if Bernie wins, I hope he talks about the adjunct problem, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez should talk about it. Julia Salazar should talk about it. All these people who identify as democratic socialists need to talk about this issue.
Yeah,
it's not tertiary. It's central because education is central to the socialist project.
Yeah, I agree. And the kind of idea that people have that graduate students or academics are in some sort of elite is is something that I think it has to go away as more and more graduate students and adjuncts are basically like living in poverty as
poverty.
Right, as they pursue their interest in telling us stories about the 19th century. You know what I mean? So, right. It's really something that I think that Americans don't generally understand the value of it, and that's part of the culture of academia maybe not talking to them. But that's I think that might change, and I think it is changing, at least as you've mentioned. I don't hope this class, or I hope this class does not fall into Nazism, but there may be a larger project. There may be a larger project.
I don't think they will.
Like with
right.
there may be a larger project. You know what I mean? And I Thaddeus Russell, you mentioned him, like he does that like Renegade University thing. I don't really pay that much attention to it, but it seems like along those lines, he's like trying to kind of shift the conversation of like what academics can do and how they can relate to the public.
And absolutely. And we could start thinking of like sort of new ways to do things. So, for example, in the 70s, New York City used to have subsidized artist housing. Why not have subsidized academic housing for all of the adjuncts as a first step so that people are literally living in their cars?
Right.
Right. These are things that politicians need to think about because, again, education is so crucial to the entire thing. And without education, it's all going to fail. And we're just going to have more Brett Kavanaughs on the Supreme Court.
Beautiful.
Right? It's top to bottom.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny. I guess I have a question for you, Daniel, which is like kind of like a philosophical one, I guess. But like a lot of what you talk about is democracy. Like you're all about kind of like broadening our sense of what democracy is, and kind of like if I'm reading your stuff right, you want a kind of wider participation of the public in the matters that govern us. But that takes like, and I'm not saying I disagree or agree, but does it take like kind of a faith in humanity, a kind of positive vision of people in order to believe in order to believe that democracy can function like that? That in other words, you have to kind of believe that minds can be moved, and that can be done on a scale as big as 300 million people in America.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and it's an important question to address. In my opinion, democracy is a gamble. but it's a gamble that you have to take because otherwise you just invest authority in a small group of people who are equally as fallen,
right.
to use a religious metaphor, as anyone else. So I think sovereignty has to be invested in the broader demos. Now the question is, and I don't like when the left says things like the people didn't vote for Nazis. Well, actually, people did vote for Nazis, and you have to take that critique seriously.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is what you actually have to do. And that Speier wasn't wrong to say. A lot of people, Hans Speier, the subject of my first book, wasn't wrong to say, a lot of people really did support the Nazis, and that was really fucked up. And his solution was essentially to basically have the public not participate in political affairs at all. And I think what happens is then you get things like Vietnam and Iraq, right? So I think what the 20th century has shown is that both sides have the potential for catastrophe. And what you need to do, I think, is invested in a broad swath of people, but also with an educational project, right? It all has to go together. It's all connected. And so it's a leap of faith in sort of the Rosenzweigian sense. Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber, these German philosophers of religion, say at some point you've got to make that leap of faith, right? And so in some degree, everyone's got to make a leap of faith because we don't have empirical confirmation for anything 100% positive. So the leap of faith that I choose to make as a conscious subjective person is to put my faith in democracy. And it is a leap of faith.
Yeah, it is a leap of faith, totally, and I get it. I mean, it's kind of like the other option is to kind of fall into a really kind of cynicism or nihilism even, and you see that actually, you see that happening today. In the American politic, it seems like there's a broad swath of people who just feel like it's all meaningless, or it's all even like it's a deep state conspiracy, which they might not be totally off on that.
Go back to Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
To go back to Joe Rogan, he's all about conspiracy theories,
right?
Because it's an incredible alienation. Alienation leads people to try to find meaning in something, and they find meaning in the lizard people, right? It's not surprising that all of these, like in the wake of the Cold War, particularly in the wake of this meaningful capital and meaningful struggle with communism, there was an explosion of conspiracy theories in the 90s.
Yeah.
You just see it in popular culture with the rise of things like the X-Files, the incredible popularity of the X-Files.
Well,
and things along those lines.
Totally. And what scares me about that moment is that people can fall into, when you fall into that kind of nihilism or feeling of powerlessness, and I think that like 1920s and 1930s Germany is a good example of this, but when you fall into this feeling of powerlessness, you look for like a simple solution. I mean, I even see that as like a guillotines, and things like that. And I feel that frustration when I watch the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. Honestly, it's kind of like it's like an impatience where it's like, oh, well, in order to defeat Brett Kavanaugh, now we're going to have this like long progressive popular movement that's like going to have to like engage all these levels of education, etc. It's like, no, why can't we make it happen faster? And that's what leads people to like gulags and violence and like all that kind of shit. It's a really tough balance.
I think that's totally correct, and I think it's a really difficult thing to know what to do. And you basically just have to personally not fall into nihilism and despair. And it's a very difficult thing to not fall into nihilism and despair, especially for our generation, because we basically live in a gerontocracy. Yeah. I mean, you had the obscene scene of all of these, some of them literally, I think, above 80, but many of them, certainly most of them above 65, if not all of them, white old Republicans sort of interrogating this woman who had the bravery to talk about her sexual assault on a international stage.
Yeah,
it's
unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
One of the most sickening political displays I've seen in my life. And that, what's interesting, and this is kind of a note about democracy, is I can sit here and you can sit here and we agree that this was one of the most sickening displays we've ever seen. But I think those were the exact words that Lindsey Graham used to describe what his view of what the Democrats are doing to Brett Kavanaugh. So it's like when you have that level of like malevolence and like that level of disagreement, I'm like, how do we bring a Lindsey Graham over to our side? It's not about that, right? It's about like surrounding.
It's not about
that. It's about like surrounding him, disarming him, and like making it so that people like that don't have a voice anymore.
And then that returns to purely political thinking, and this isn't like the friend-enemy distinction, right?
Yes.
And this is what a lot of people are arguing on the left now about making the friend-enemy distinction. And I need to make an academic point. Sorry, listeners.
Do it.
But the basically the friend-enemy distinction has been linked to Carl Schmitt, who was basically a fascist or Nazi jurist. But what actual historical research has shown is that the friend-enemy distinction has had a much wider swath of sort of endorsers on the Weimar political spectrum, from the far left people like Otto Kirchheimer, who was a member of the Frankfurt School. People might have heard of them.
Yeah.
To liberals like Karl Mannheim. So the friend-enemy distinction, in the sense of being the ultimate distinction of politics, is not necessarily a fascist thing. I think it's actually a useful way, if not the only way, to understand politics. And I agree with you. Someone like Lindsey Graham might be usefully considered a political enemy, right? Someone who's not going to be able to be won over. So the question is, how do you change the structures so that your political enemy is not able to succeed in the way that he has? And in this context, it's almost always a he. It's a real difficult question.
Yeah, we find them in restaurants and we yell at them until they leave.
Well, that's not going to be that's not this. I mean, maybe that's the emotional solution to make you feel good, but I don't think that's the political solution.
And when I say it's the emotional thing or when you say that, and I agree with that, it is an emotional thing that makes you feel good. I do think it's bad strategy, but at the same time, it seems like the thrust of history might be on the emotional side of things right now. You know what I mean? Like
right, like, sure.
I mean, people are watching right now like video of Jeff Flake being yelled at by women in an elevator. Another really sickening display, honestly, because he's such a coward. You can't even look at these women as they're literally describing their own sexual assaults to him, and you know, it's a really, I mean, incredible, extraordinary, ugly scene. But there's also like this need to like, and I know you feel it too, because I've seen like frustrated posts from you on social media, and I know we've, you know, this idea of like, I don't know, and I brought this up to Nathan Robinson when we talked last week, which is like this idea that it's kind of like, you know, what motivates my leftism is on the one hand kind of like this positive utopic vision of what we could build, but what also motivates my leftism, and maybe even more so, is my absolute hatred of the right, and my like desire to see them punished, and my desire to see them, you know, like completely destroyed. And I mean that in every single way. And I know that, like, you know, people's frustrations come out in all sorts of ways, but like there's a real, what do you do with that? What do you do with your like, because you've got a great, beautiful vision of democracy and what we can be, but what do you do with your frustration with like the right? Because I know you hate them as much as I do.
Well, I think this is where being a historian helps me, because I know where that leads. That leads to the guillotine.
Yes.
And then the revolution always devours its own.
Right.
Right. So I think this is why having a historical sense is important. So like, I could totally understand why the Bolsheviks wanted to kill the entire Tsarist line. You know, of course,
yes.
Of course. I could totally understand why the French peasants wanted to kill the Dauphin. And if anyone goes back to an old Onion, they have this hilarious thing with Ask the Dauphin, and the first one's like, "Daddy, I love my cakes," and it eventually ends with him in like a prison cell. It's really funny. I strongly recommend you read it. Yeah. But I think this is why having a historical sense, because also history matters. In my opinion, history matters, and the violent revolutions have always devoured their own. And so that's ultimately why I don't come out in favor of that sort of like hatred as being the ultimate motivating factor of politics. You need the positive vision, just because of what's happened historically. Yeah. You know, it always happens. Look what happened in the Cultural Revolution is one of the worst things to happen to humanity. The Khmer Rouge committed some of the worst genocides in human history. Yeah. You know, so you have to have a historical sense about the limits of revolution as a political act to bring about broad-based change. And ultimately, that's why I'm a Democrat. That's why I'm someone who wants to have democratic basis to think, and not a vanguardist in the Leninist sense, or a Maoist in a third worldist sense.
When you say you're a Democrat, you mean like a small D Democrat?
Yeah, small D, please. Yeah,
I literally thought we were going to end this conversation with you being like, and that's why I supported Hillary Clinton in the 2006. Like, wait, what?
Yeah, and that's why I just believed America is already great.
Yeah, right.
Small D Democrat.
That was a twist. The twist ending that this was all an advertisement for you to go out and vote for the Democrats. Which, you know, it sounds like you would advise. Actually, I mean,
it depends. Yeah. I mean, it depends on what a certain situation. I mean, unfortunately, what I would ultimately advise is have a new constitution. And we're the only Western industrial democracy or post-industrial democracy that is still living on their 18th century constitution. So that's wild, you know. And so we should totally go back to the beginning. Yeah.
And even if you're totally, I mean, even if you vote for Democrats, great. Like, who cares? But like, we have to have a broader understanding what politics is beyond voting, right? Like,
exactly.
Like, it's like, vote for Democrats, sure, but then like kick their ass constantly with like a popular political movement. Don't just like vote for them and expect them to do the right thing, because they're not going to. Like, if history proves anything, it proves that, like, once they get in there, you know, and we saw it, and I hate to say it, but you see it with, like, these candidates right now. Even the guy in Florida, is Gillum, I think, Andrew Gillum.
Oh yeah, he's already turned to the right, right?
Yeah, not only that, but turning to the right on like foreign policy issues, like the stuff you're talking about. Like, he's basically talking about invading Venezuela,
which is so bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is. So we could go round and round, but thank you, Daniel. I had a really great time talking with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. I really had a good time as well.
Take care. Okay, everybody, I want to thank my guest, Daniel Bessner. I always have a great time talking with him. We'll have him again on the show. Very smart dude, and really interesting ideas. Thanks so much, Daniel, and thanks for everyone listening to the show and supporting it. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Please check out subscribing to the show. It helps us a lot, and I hope you have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.